Did you know that a political action committee is a tax-exempt organization that collects and donates campaign contributions for or against candidates, ballot initiatives, or legislation? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about politics in the United States on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll explore the current political landscape with podcasters Kevin O'Neill and Robert Caruso. But first, a trivia question. In what year was the first Political Action Committee formed? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Kevin O'Neill and Robert Caruso on the show today. Kevin O'Neill was trained as an accountant and banker. He has been a self-described political junkie for the last 20 years. His podcasting partner, Robert Caruso, is an MBA cybersecurity professional, political junkie, and fine wine and spirit connoisseur. Over their lifetime, Kevin and Robert have watched the American political system deteriorate right before their eyes. They felt that the country deserves better and wanted to make a difference. Last year, they formed a political action committee called the Sensible Center PAC. It focuses on political reform. In June 2023, they started a podcast to promote the PAC and talk about current political issues and political reform. They wanted to show that two people from very different political ideologies, Kevin being left-leaning and Robert being a libertarian, can have respectful and vigorous debates and still remain friends. Welcome to the show, Kevin and Robert. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having us.
Hi. Hello, everybody.
Kevin, what's the most unique thing about you?
Me personally?
Yes.
Personally, I would say that I'm unique because I'm a retired banker who has progressive views on politics. I mean, that's not something you run into every day. So I would say that's kind of a unique thing that I have, and people are always surprised when they hear me express my political views.
And Robert, what's the most unique thing about you?
You know, I really don't think I'm unique when you compare me to other people. I like to think it's my experiences and mistakes that make me unique. I've certainly been lucky when it comes to not suffering huge consequences for some of the mistakes I've made in my life. But I think that learning from my mistakes and learning from others has been vitally important to who I am. So all that said, I would expect others to be unique in the same manner. Everybody's got slightly different experiences, different mistakes that they've made, different people they've learned from. And that's the only way I could consider myself to be unique. There's really nothing about me that's special in capability or meaning.
Can I revise my answer? Because Bob got deep there. No, I don't want to revise it.
That was a great answer, Kevin.
It was a good answer.
And how did the two of you meet?
It's a pretty interesting story. My wife and I owned wine shops in the Chicago area during the early 2000s. And so Deb would always come home after, a late night where she was tasting out wines with a certain someone named Bob. And she would say, and they would have these long discussions about politics and pretty much everything under the sun. And she'd go, "You need to meet this guy someday." And so eventually we did meet, probably about 17 years ago. And after many bottles of wine and bourbon and long discussions, we're still very good friends. And it's kind of an interesting way to meet over. It was a customer of ours, and now they're friends.
Yeah, I still remember the first time I met Kevin. They were having a special event that night of some sort. I believe it was probably what they would call an if you insist tasting. It was the higher end wines sometime around the holidays, I believe. And first time I talked to him, and I thought, he's a pretty easy enough guy to get along with. We didn't talk politics or, anything of too much import. Probably talked wine a bit. And then just through becoming friends with Kevin and Deborah, and of course my wife and my kids as they eventually occurred, we became closer friends, and we tried to vacation together. We have vacation together. And we both have a love for politics. I think we love to argue politics. Both Kevin and Deborah love to argue politics. And honestly, I think we all find great joy in it, not only in the debate and the challenge of debating each other, but also in kind of, poking at each other just a little bit to see if we can get a reaction. It's really one of the great joys of my life is, debating politics with Kevin, to be honest with you.
And tell us what the Sensible Center means.
So when we were thinking about a name we formed a political action committee, and we're doing a podcast under the same name. It was kind of to realize that in politics, everyone's been focusing on the extremes, either the left or the right. And I think a lot of the country and a lot of people reside in the center. So I think the media, political parties are looking for clicks, ratings, votes. And so they focus in on the extremes. And my thought was always that there are so many people that probably can agree on a lot of things, even though they might be more left or more right. But I think there's a center that is sensible, that realizes we're only going to win if we all win together versus one side winning against the other. That's not the way it's going to work in this country.
It's really about finding common ground. It's okay to disagree on things. It's okay to disagree on, an end, and it's okay to agree on an end and disagree on the means of getting to that end, whatever it happens to be. But if we can just find common ground, strive towards getting to that common ground, we believe that the country will be a better place. And you can really see some of that happening just in the last week and a half, 2 weeks. It's been a crazy political week. It's been a crazy week in the IT and cybersecurity world with multiple hacks either having occurred or have been announced and had occurred earlier, as well as, of course, that big mistake with CrowdStrike last week. There's all kinds of things going on in the world. People are financially worried, politically worried. There's more and more division, so it's harder and harder to find common ground with people. And your friends and your family aren't necessarily a zone of comfort anymore. We really wanted to turn the conversation to a point where people could get together, focus on one thing, and really get the divisiveness out of politics. And we do have a set of rules on how we think we can get there.
And why did you form the Political Action Committee? What did you hope to achieve?
So, Political Action Committee, we started in hopes that we could influence politicians to become more centrist, or at least push us in a more centrist direction. What I mean by that are things that I think a lot of Americans can agree on. Something like term limits, for instance. A lot of our congressmen, our representatives, and our senators have been in office for dozens of years, even 30, 40 years, decades. You can see those people kind of digging in, getting richer, listening to their lobbyists more so than their constituents. And because of their name and their time in power, oftentimes you see that they're easily reelected. And if you look at polling around the country, everybody thinks Congress is doing a terrible job. The Senate's doing a horrible job. The House is doing a horrible job, but everybody loves their own person. And why is that? Because money is being funneled into the local economy, and it's not in an efficient manner, right? So I think the people would be better represented, and lobbyists would be drowned out a bit if we could have some type of term limits in both the House and the Senate. That's one. I think campaign finance reform is another thing that we want to drive at, right? So we'd like to influence politicians, obviously making donations, hopefully eventually being able to set up meetings and things so we can talk to them about campaign finance reform. We know the Supreme Court has made that kind of difficult in their ruling in the past. We still think it can be done, whether it's through creative means or maybe even a revisiting by the Supreme Court eventually down the road as the court changes and has changed. Because we need to get the money out of politics. And if we don't get the money out of politics, we're going to continue down this path where it gets more and more divisive. People have an interest in keeping things divisive for personal gain. And then, of course, also we want to talk about some of the other centrist ideas, such as less war, more efficient use of our taxes, cutting spending where possible, where it makes sense. And then, Kevin, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of add to what Bob has said, we're, as you mentioned, we're both sort of political junkies. And over the last 10 years or so, we've come to the realization that more and more our political system is pretty broken. And I think what has occurred over the last year, and especially over the last couple weeks, just is indicative of that kind of brokenness. So there's a actual burgeoning democracy and reform movement out there. It's out there. People are doing things. You don't hear it from our politicians, though, right? You don't really hear them talking about term limits. Why? Because it affects them. So it's got to be a groundswell movement from the people to actually nourish and reform our democracy, which I think is sort of threatened. You hear both political parties saying democracy's on the ballot this year, but they're not talking about reforming it. They're just threatening that the other side is going to take it away, right? That you're going to have an autocrat in office one way or another, or a socialist or whatnot. And they feed off of the fact that they like us fighting against each other. So I think part of the idea of the PAC is to sort of encourage politicians to begin talking about these things. And as Bob said, there's different things. I would say that probably 70 or 80% of the public support term limits, but you don't see it on any of the politicians' agendas or platforms or anything like that. And we could get into further about some of the organizations that are out there that we talked about and talked with on our show. But we're just trying to do our little part to kind of push the ball forward as much as we can.
And you also started a podcast. How does the podcast relate to your PAC?
So the podcast is primarily to show people that you can have political discussions over any type of topic. Bob and I are friends. We don't always agree. Like I said, there's room for agreement, and we talk about where we agree. And so I'm more of a leftward leaning progressive. I think that there's a role for government, and I think government should not only protect its citizens, but sort of move the ball forward. So I'm more of a quote unquote big government sort of guy, or Bob, he could talk about his views, but he's more of a limited government. So part of the podcast is not only to discuss the political reform movements, and we've had various organizations on our show to discuss what they're doing, but also to highlight and talk about the latest political issues. We talk about Supreme Court decisions, various things, and we get our various opinions, and we sort of sort through what we think and try to reach some type of agreement on these things. So that's part of what the podcast was, not only to promote our ideas and the political action committee, but to show that having these conversations is possible amongst friends. And I think it's the history of this country has shown that from the times of the founders, where they gathered in pubs and talked about these things, that we do need to realize our neighbors are our fellow citizens, and we can't treat them as our enemies.
I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. Talking about me a little bit, I'm a right-leaning libertarian. I've often in the past, although less so lately, referred to myself as so libertarian that I'm a true conservative, because I really don't think conservatives are conservatives anymore. I think many cases they spend as much, if not more, than the Democrats or the left leaning people in society. We really want to get back to a place where money is spent wisely and in the best interest of the people, not in the best interest of the rich. And Kevin hit it on the head from the standpoint of the content of the podcast and what we try to do. We do often try to talk politics. That's most what we talk. Sometimes we'll take it a little off topic. We're not shy about the fact that we have a few drinks during the podcast. And really, before the podcast started, we had kind of joked, we'd go visit a wine country or somewhere else, bourbon country, and we talk about in some of our lubricated conversations about how great it would be to have a TV show or a radio show where, as we get more influenced by the alcohol, our politics ramp up a little bit. We get a little bit more meaner and we argue a little bit more louder, and it's kind of funny some of the things we say together. And so with the podcasts and in the environment now, where it's so easy to do, we decided to go ahead and try to build the pack, have the podcast as well, and then just kind of see what works. One of the other things that we've been able to do with it, which I think has been really interesting and we want to do a lot more of, is have guests. So we've been able to bring in people that Kevin's met, for instance, at a political convention. There's also people that we happen to be friends with, or even extended family that we think are great candidates to be guests on the podcast because they bring something interesting to the conversation, whether it's a point of view or it's just a life experience or what else. And it's a great opportunity to learn from people, meet people, get new ideas.
Many Americans are distressed with the political conversations and where the U.S. political scene is headed. Is there reason for hope?
I believe there is. And even though it's kind of hard to hold on to at times, especially when we get involved with the media and social media, and we need to kind of back away from that a little bit and get perspective. But I guess what I would say is that there's hope, that there's, like I mentioned, there's tons of people out there working at the grassroots level trying to make things better. I think there's a tremendous love of this country still, and realizing that we might be, I think awareness is the key to having hope, right? And I think more people are aware of what's going on with politics, even though there's a lot of misinformation and whatever out there. I do think people are more engaged than they've been in a long time. I think the younger people need to get more engaged, and I tell my nieces and nephews that this is their future and they need to start paying attention, because, I mean, not to be chicken little, but I do think we are reaching some type of point here in this country where, and we've gone through it before and we're resilient. That's another reason for hope. Our democracies, not something to take for granted. And I think it's fragile at some points, but we've gotten through a lot in this country. But it does take concerted effort to get through that. And it does take everyone sort of pushing. So that's why I'm hopeful, because I think the political parties would like us to be apathetic and cynical, because then we're, not paying attention to what's going on there. And I think, and fighting amongst each other, which we need to really stop doing. And sort of focus in on where we want to head. And that's a little bit about leadership, but it's also about us taking responsibility as citizens for our country.
There's always hope. And I think there's more than hope. I'm confident that everything's going to be fine in this country moving forward. We're America. We always seem to find a way. We innovate. We're one of the best countries in the world at innovation. We probably are the best country in the world when it comes to innovation. We're going to find innovative new ways to move ahead, right? There's so many different levels we can talk here, but you could start with the candidates, right? Candidates and their campaigning and the hate speech and all of that, and it gets amplified on social media. None of that really, the things they're really fighting about matter so much in the scheme of things. What matters so much from the standpoint of America keeping going is driving the economy, right? And because we're so great at innovation, we can continue to drive those things. And I think innovative solutions will solve even some of the back and forth on things like the green movement, right? I think my standpoint is I don't like a lot of government funding when it comes to green technology. We're subsidizing that stuff at the expense of other industry, which I don't think is fair. It's at the expense of American people because we're spending dollars and we're picking favorites and things like that. That said, because we innovate so well, there's something new that's going to make the current green technology kind of fall off. Whether it's hydrogen cars, whether it's fusion, whatever it happens to be, something nobody's even thought of yet, going to drive these improvements. And some of the arguing about what green technology works and not, that's going to fall away, right? That's the key. Is as long as we continue to innovate, we're going to be fine. What does scare me is the spending, right? Again, while candidates are arguing negative speech about each other, we continue to spend. I read today that the majority now of the taxes coming into the country are spent on paying interest on our debt. And that's concerning to me because we're going to get to a point where we're paying more on interest on the debt than we can afford to pay. We really need to focus the conversation on that, solving these problems. And I'll use the innovation track. I do think through innovation, we can solve that problem. Whether it's AI, I think some of it's probably AI, some of it'll be innovation of new technologies and things like that. We will get there, absolutely. But it's America. I mean, we don't just need hope. We're going to be just fine. We come together when we need. You can look at any disaster that's happened in history. We come together.
Tell us about some political reform organizations you think that can affect real change.
As Bob mentioned, I've attended 2 democracy summits where all these organizations come together and talk about what they're doing, strategize about different approaches and plans. There was one in LA last year that I attended. Deb and I attended one in New Orleans pre-COVID, and they're going to have one next year, which is really interesting and builds excitement. I get excited when I see people, and like I said, there's a lot of hardworking people. So, and some of the people we've had on our podcast, like for instance, we've had a group called 100% Democracy. And the idea behind this group is that it's sort of a requirement to vote. If you're an eligible voter, which they do actually do in Australia and several other countries around the world, they're not going to throw you in jail, but there is sort of minor penalties, or there is some incentive to get out and vote. Because through that process, we're going to get everyone involved more, right? There's not going to be underrepresented people. And so I think part of something like that might be having a national holiday being election day, or, in this country, we prize the vote, but sometimes we make it difficult for people to do that, right? So there's all these movements that look at things like that. We had a group on called Braver Angels. Their focus is on teaching people communication skills so that they can have productive conversations across the political divide, especially with friends and family, which has become a big issue amongst people now. And they do online courses. Very, very great organization. 2 other ones that I've been involved with over the years is one called Move to Amend. So they're seeking, with the Citizens United ruling, as far as super PACs and all the money flowing into politics, they're pushing an amendment to the Constitution that indicates that corporations aren't people and therefore don't have the rights that people do under the Constitution, and also that money is not speech, which then will allow limitations on funding of our representatives in elections, which I think creates not only a burden on them to have to raise money, which takes them away from the duty of governing us, but also tends to lead to us being underrepresented, and the loudest voices are the ones that have the money, right? So that's an interesting movement. They've progressed. And another one is Represent Us. And you can find all these on the internet. And I encourage people to go out and explore and get involved with them. Represent Us more focuses on sort of the corruption. They're more of an anti-corruption, focusing on the lobbying industry, and also I think pushing the term limits agenda and getting some of those political reforms done. So there's a wealth of ideas. There's groups that do ranked choice voting, which has been put into certain municipalities and states. There's organizations that do publicly funded elections. Open primaries these are all different areas of the reform movement that organizations are focusing on. And they start at the local and state levels, and the hope is to build to the national level.
I'm with Kevin on a lot of those organizations he mentioned, especially the couple that he mentioned that were on our podcast, Braver Angels specifically. I'm going to take it, another direction. I think I really think more so than organizations right now, social media and individuals on social media play a huge role in forming our conversation. Some might say that it's overly divisive and it's causing more problems than it solves. I tend to disagree with that. I think there's obviously individuals out there who kind of fan flames, but if you really look and you talk about who makes good, solid, valuable points in a conversational tone, maybe adds a few memes in there with some humor, they do more to influence people and knowledge and inform people leading up to the election than a lot of these larger groups do. The problem is, in a lot of cases, they do get a bad rap because of some people are intentionally divisive, intentionally misleading, intentionally malicious on these sites. But they have X, or Twitter specifically, has done so much to form this political landscape. They've influenced the political landscape. You can look at the recent Biden resignation that was announced on Twitter. It didn't go on TV. He didn't write an article in the newspaper. And because he did that, it really didn't leak out until it happened. It was a huge news story, and the effects of it we won't know for probably years, definitely weeks or months. And it's really interesting to me. These larger organizations, I think, as you get bigger, more money is involved, there's more problems and potentially less credibility that comes with that money. It's these social media organizations, I think, that are just going to drive change the most. And I love X. I'd like to make a comment on Facebook as well. About a year or two, maybe 3 years ago now, Facebook stopped putting political conversation on news feeds. There used to be a point where you could go to Facebook and have a conversation about politics with your friends and family, and people would argue, and I enjoyed it. Now Facebook really just takes it off people's timelines. So a lot of the stuff that your friends and family post from a political perspective seen by your friends and family anymore, they've taken it off the timelines completely. They wanted to back out of the political conversation. I was reading that some of that is because they were tired of side A or side B complaining and reporting people, and it was driving a lot of extra work. They were also getting a lot of complaints from the government, and they were not wanting to deal with that and the blowback from silencing or censoring somebody at the behest of the government. And also, of course, all the advertising money they get, they were afraid that the political conversation was driving them somewhere towards not being able to get at the advertisers anymore, or embarrassing their advertisers. But what I found is now kind of Facebook isn't as much fun anymore. You don't converse in some of the important ways that you may have with people that you've got connections to anymore. And you don't have the opportunity to really not only learn what other people's views are, but also inform other people of your views and maybe create a bond with people that you went to school with 20, 30 years ago. You've got a similar background, and you're more likely to find common ground with these people than you may be with some random person on Twitter that lives thousands of miles away that you've never met. That said, Twitter, on the other hand, has embraced it. They've embraced the political conversation. They allow it to happen, and there's amazing points of view. There's amazing journalism reaching people now that maybe never would have been reaching people before. Like Barry Weiss, for instance. She's kind of a left center of the road journalist and writer, and she's great. I probably would not have read a lot of what she does. I definitely would not have read it in the New York Times. I don't read that paper. But a lot of the writing she does now, I'll read because she'll post it out there on Twitter. It's great advertising, great opportunity to get her point of view and read great writing, whether I agree with her opinion or not. Twitter's done a lot of that. They've enabled a lot of that. Citizen journalism, bringing everyday people into the conversations, it's valuable. It's changing the world, and I really do think it's going to change people in the direction of the country far more than many of these organizations will.
Is Elon paying you for the marketing pitch?
He's not, but I'm going to call him right after.
He's got a lot of money.
The podcast.
Jeez. There you go.
Where can listeners find out more about your podcast or get involved with your PAC?
Right now, the best way to do it is to listen to our podcast, which will provide you all of our activities and really get you up to date on anything you need to know. We encourage people to only listen to us for all their political news. Really, I don't know what Bob says about Twitter, but
not only are we the smartest people out there, but we are the most humorous people out there.
Yeah, we do have a good time, and we'd love to build our following because I listen to a lot of podcasts, and yours is great, Karen. But I think there's a lot of not so great ones out there, and so we'd like to get some of the people who are listening to those to listen to our podcast. So it's the Sensible Centercast. You can find it on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or just post the RSS feed into any of your favorite apps that you listen to podcasts on. But that's probably the best way. We're rebuilding our website, which we hope to have up later in the year. But the best way is to kind of tune into us. We typically do twice a month, bi-weekly podcasts, which, like I said, we'll be doing one this week because there's been so much news over the last 2 weeks that I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about.
Also on Twitter or X it's at USASCPAC. It's at USASCPAC.
And I will put a link to your podcast in the show notes.
Lovely. That'd be great.
It was great to have you on the show, Kevin and Robert. Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you much. It was great.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. In what year was the first Political Action Committee formed? The first Political Action Committee, the Congress of Industrial Organizations Political Action Committee, was formed in July 1943. We'll end the show with something punny. Why did the politician bring a ladder to a rally? Because they wanted to climb in the polls. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.